I have not done a proper how to build a PC tutorial video since like 2020, so it is now time in 2023 to update things a little bit. Have things changed when it comes to building your own PC? Maybe a little bit, but a lot of stuff is still the same. Today I'm going to be building a system with the parts I have here. The total cost is about $900, and this goes along with the around $1,250-ish full system setup that I started off the year with. This is also a tutorial designed for beginners, so I'm going to be walking you through the build process step by step, so let's get started.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Micro Center. This is one of my favorite places to buy PC parts. So if you're building or upgrading your PC, I highly recommend making your way down to one of their 25 retail stores in the US. They have consistently competitive prices and an excellent selection of PC hardware and other tech goodies. And they have a custom PC builder on the Micro Center website. Use it to spec out your rig and it will show you parts in store at your nearest location while ensuring compatibility. Then you can pick up in store or have their pros assemble it for you. So click the sponsor link in the description to find a Micro Center near you. So with my PC build guides, I often say that all you need is a screwdriver, and that is still mostly true, but there are a few other things that I'm assuming you're bringing to the party today. One is that you have already watched my part 1 video where I explain all the different parts of a computer. We're going to be working with the 7 core components, doing a budget build today, but I'm going to be spending a little bit less time explaining what each part is and more time explaining how the parts actually fit together. I'm also assuming that you have chosen the parts for your PC and purchased them and have them on hand, and if you're still looking, check out my monthly parts list videos where I give suggestions for parts that I would choose if building your own system. The only other things that you should need for this project are about 1 to 4 hours of time, depending on how fast you work and how complex your build actually is. A nice open workspace, preferably something that's high enough to keep it out of the reach of animals and small children. Something to protect the surface you're working on, like a large mouse mat, is a good idea. Some scissors or a cutting tool to open up your boxes, and of course, a screwdriver. And you will want a Phillips head version, although a Phillips head and a slot screwdriver are good to have. And you don't need a super fancy screwdriver like the LTT ones. You can totally get away with a basic one. But you might also consider both a normal sized and a small or teeny tiny screwdriver, as I like to call them. Mine came from my iFixit kit. That is for mounting some of the smallest components in the build, like our little M.2 drive over there. And that pretty much sums up our preparation checklist. One last thing to note is that I'm building an AM4 system, which is last generation for the AMD processors that are out there. But if you're doing a build on one of the newer platforms like AM5 for AMD or LGA 1700 for Intel, I will be showing you how to do the installation for those CPUs too. Let's quickly run down the parts I will be building with today. I already covered these in my build guide video, but just to point out, we have a Ryzen 5 5600 CPU that's going to run you about $130. And this also comes with a stock heatsink fan, a stock cooler as it's known, so we will not need to be adding that on as an 8th item. I'm recommending a $350 to $400 GPU for this budget range, and today I'll be building with the RTX 3060 Ti. This is the Asus Tough gaming version of that card. Of course, if you're still considering products, you should also consider the Radeon RX 6700 XT, which can be found in the same price range and will give a little bit better performance in terms of frame rates. So those are the two main components of the build that most affect our performance. Everything else is just making sure that those can work properly. Our power supply is a Cooler Master Masterwatt 750 bronze. I caught this one on sale for this build because it's partially modular, 80 plus bronze rated, and again 750 watts, which means if I did want to upgrade the graphics card in the future, I could without needing to swap in a more powerful power supply. And the PSU in this budget range is going to cost $70 to $80. Our motherboard is the Gigabyte B550 Gaming XV2, and part of the reason we're building on AM4, even though it is last generation, is because you can still find reasonably priced motherboards, and you should be spending around $120 to $150 for a reasonable B550 board. If you're building with AM5 or Intel's latest platform, the motherboard's probably going to run you closer to $200 at minimum. Here's our memory, 16 gigs total, 2 18 gigabyte sticks of DDR4 memory. We went with this kit because it costs around $45, which is a great bang for the buck. And do note that if you're building on AM5, you need a DDR5 memory, not DDR4. And if you're building on Intel LGA 1700, your motherboard will actually determine whether you're using DDR4 or DDR5, so double check that. I have once again spent an extra $10 to $20 on the case. This is the NZXT H510 Flow, and this is going to run you around $90. Sometimes it goes on sale for a little bit less than that, but it has good airflow, pre-installed fans, a nice big tempered glass panel, and a USB 3.2 Gen 2 front panel connector for USB Type-C, which is nice to have. And rounding things out with our storage, we have the Kingston NV2. This is a great bang for the buck. It's a 1 terabyte drive for about $50, maybe a few dollars more than that. And no, it is not the fastest NVMe drive that's out there, but it's way faster than a SATA drive. I have now taken a few minutes to get all of the components out of their retail boxes. Hopefully you guys don't need a walkthrough for that. It is one of the very entertaining parts of building a new PC, especially if you're opening brand new parts, which is really satisfying. But other than the case, which I'll get to in a moment, because we're going to do what's known as an outside the box build first to make sure that our components are functional before we go to the trouble of installing them into the case. So I've grabbed each part and the accessories that you might need. So we have our CPU and the heatsink fan that came installed in the box. We have our NVMe M.2 SSD right here. We don't actually need this for this part, but since we're doing all the motherboard setup anyway, we might as well drop it in too. We're gonna need our memory kit, of course. We're gonna need our motherboard, screwdrivers. Yes, we got the big and the small Phillips head. I always like to have my motherboard manual handy while doing a build because there are often things that you're like, uh-oh, I gotta check the manual for that. And for this specific build, that's all you should need because this motherboard has a fixed I/O shield here on the side, which is nice. And we just have a single M.2 NVMe drive to install. However, not all motherboards have a fixed I/O shield, so you're gonna wanna grab that out of your motherboard box too. We will be using this when we install the board into the case, unless of course you have a fixed I/O shield, in which case you won't need to do that. And then if you'll be adding additional storage besides your M.2 drive to your build, so if you have any 2.5-inch SSDs or 3.5-inch hard drives that use a SATA connector for data and that also require a separate power connector, you'll want to grab a SATA cable out of your motherboard's box for each drive that you plan to connect. Now again, you do not need to connect your storage for the outside the box test build that we're going to do right now, but I just wanted to make sure as you're taking stuff out of the retail boxes that you're grabbing all the stuff you might need. For our power supply, we will need the AC cable, the one that actually plugs into the wall. And then if you have a modular power supply, it'll probably come with a bunch of modular cables like this. And these are primarily Molex, SATA, and PCI Express power connectors. Because this is a partially modular power supply, so the connectors that we'll always need, the 24-pin and 8-pin that plug into the motherboard, are hardwired. Finally, we have our graphics card because we need a graphics card to get a video out signal. If you're building on an Intel platform that has an integrated GPU as part of the CPU, or if you're building on the AM5 platform where most of the CPUs have integrated graphics as well, you can actually get by without the graphics card for the outside the box build. Although if you do that, then you wouldn't be testing your graphics card to make sure it works too. Also, to complete our testing, we will need some of the other components for our full setup: monitor, keyboard, maybe a mouse if you want to grab it right now. And then when I come back for the part 4 setup video where we actually install Windows and everything, you will need another computer, a laptop or otherwise, to get that done. That's really just an FYI for now, but something you will want to have on hand when we get to the setup phase. Enough talking, let's get this build underway. I'm going to start off with the CPU installation, and here is where I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways because we have the AM4 socket right here, then I will show you AM5 and then LGA 1700 for Intel, so feel free to jump ahead to the socket that you will be using yourself. I've started off by using a Phillips head screwdriver, and I cheated because it's a powered one, but you can use a manual one if you want. And I'm just removing this top retention bracket, and incidentally, AM5 and AM4 are going to be really similar in this respect. AM5 and AM4 actually have the same dimensions here for CPU coolers, and they're actually intercompatible. So if you have an AM4 compatible CPU cooler, it should work with AM5 as well. I recommend putting these brackets in a plastic baggie and saving them with your motherboard because some aftermarket CPU coolers do use them. We're installing a stock heatsink fan, and that uses the pre-installed backplate that AM4 and AM5 motherboards have. Just note that now that that bracket is gone, that backplate is no longer stuck to the board. Also note that your stock heatsink fan will come with some thermal paste pre-applied on the bottom. You don't want to touch that or smudge it or mess it around at all. For this beginner's guide, I'm assuming that you're going to be using the pre-applied thermal paste there, and in the follow-up part 3 video where I do a more advanced build, I will cover stuff like removing thermal paste that's already there or applying your own. We have our CPU here. We're going to install it to the CPU socket. This is an AM4 CPU, which means it has pins on the bottom. These pins are fairly delicate, so do your best not to bend them or mash them at all. And in fact, you can kind of look down the side to double check and make sure that you don't have any bent pins. If you do have bent pins out of the box, they are not impossible to bend back and repair, but it might mean that your CPU doesn't drop into the socket properly. Now, the orientation of the CPU in the socket is very important. It only goes in one way. And while there is a specific pin grid on the bottom that you can sort of align with the pin grid on the socket, there is an easier way, and that's to look for the little gold triangle that's right on the corner of the CPU. It should be visible from the bottom of the CPU as well as from the top. I do not know why they have made these little triangles so very, very tiny with the most recent generation, but this is fortunately universal between AMD and Intel CPUs. A small gold triangle, very small in some instances, at the corner to show you which one lines up with the little triangle that's on the actual socket. Once you've determined the proper orientation for AM4, you just gotta pull out and lift up this little side arm here that will release the socket, and then the CPU should drop straight in. Let me do that one more time just to show you guys how easily it should drop straight into the socket. This is known as a ZIF socket, zero insertion force. I have zero insertion force t-shirts on my store if you're interested. But if it doesn't drop straight in, don't push it down and try to force it, pull it out and double check for bent pins. Then you just push this arm down to lock it into place. After that, our cooler installation is fairly simple, again, assuming you have pre-installed thermal paste. So I'm just gonna drop the cooler on top of the 4 mounting points for the back plate, and those 4 screws should line up. There is a bit of a protrusion on one side of the AMD stock cooler, and that can go on either side, but double check to make sure if it's on this side that it's not blocking a RAM slot. And you'll also want to make sure that the fan plug, which is probably going to be a standard 4-pin PWM fan plug, can reach over to the CPU fan header on your motherboard. And you do want to use the CPU fan header because your motherboard will be monitoring that to make sure your CPU is being cooled. And if it doesn't detect a fan running on the CPU fan header, it can sometimes throw an error. I'm getting ahead of myself though, we should be mounting the CPU cooler first. So I'm just going to do a few twists on each of these screws just to get it threaded onto the back plate. And because we want that thermal paste to spread evenly and we don't want to put too much pressure on one corner of the CPU, we're just going to go sort of in a crosswise pattern and give each of these screws a couple twists at a time. And we'll keep going in that way until they are all cinched down. And there we have it. Our 5600 is installed as well as our CPU cooler. But what if you're building on AM5? Here's a quick rundown of AM5 CPU installation on an AM5 motherboard. Once again, we have 2 plastic brackets to remove. There are many similarities between AM4 and AM5 for the CPU coolers. But here you may note there is a protective cover on the socket, and that's because AM5 CPUs are LGA. That is known as land grid array. So they just have pads or contact points on the CPU itself, and the pins are actually on the motherboard side. That makes the motherboard much more delicate, which is why they put protective covers over those. And I'm gonna recommend leaving that protective cover on. For one, the protective cover also has a little triangle on the corner, just like our CPU, and I'm glad that with the AM5 Ryzen 7000 CPUs, AMD has gone back to a larger golden triangle in the corner. And you can see it there on the socket cover as well as on the socket itself. The retention mechanism is a lever over here that you push down and move out, and then that will allow it to lift up. That releases a catch down at the bottom that lets you lift up this retention plate, and the CPU is going to go under that. Again, super delicate pins here. Do not touch or damage them at all if you can avoid it. So let's run through the installation. The corner is aligned, and fortunately with these, they also just make the text face up, which is cool. We're going to lift the lever. We're going to lift the retention bracket all the way up. We're going to gently drop the CPU down in the socket, and here you can also reality check because there are 2 notches in the actual PCB of this CPU, and those should align with 2 notches on the socket itself, and those are a little bit off center. I'm just going to drop it straight down into the socket, and with the LGA CPUs I like to give it just the lightest jiggle to make sure it's settled there. We can then lower the lid, make sure the catch is catching there, and then if we pop this down, the cover should come right off and our CPU is installed. And again, because of the similarities with AM4, you can just go ahead and install your CPU cooler from there, following the same steps that I used with the AM4 installation. And here's our Intel CPU with an LGA 1700 socket, which is what Intel is currently on for their 12th and 13th gen CPUs. Physically, there is not really a difference between them. But again, just like with AM5, we're working with an LGA CPU, so we have contact pads on the CPU and pins on the motherboard socket. And again, just like with AM5, the installation is fairly similar. We have a retention lever on the side that hooks onto a catch right there. We have a retention bracket that lifts up from the top this time, not from the bottom. And again, delicate pins on the motherboard that we want to be careful not to damage, so we'll leave the cover on again. Intel CPUs have a triangle on the corner, very, very small. There's also a triangle on the corner of the cover. That triangle should be etched into the bracket as well. And again, we have some physical notches on the CPU, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, that you can use to reality check that you're lining stuff up correctly. And so here's our installation. We will lift up the retention arm. We will flip back the protective cover. We carefully and gently drop the CPU into the socket, aligning with the notches on the top and the bottom. Give it a bit of a light jiggle to make sure it's settled. And then I would like to close this side and do the same thing that we did with AM5, but it doesn't work quite as well with LGA 1700. So I'm just gonna pop this bracket off myself and then close this so that the retention arm can properly engage. From here, again, sticking to basics, we can install our Intel stock heatsink fan. You might have gotten one that looks kind of like this. I do not have thermal paste on this one, so I'm just using it as a demonstration, but double check that you have thermal paste pre-applied on the bottom of yours. And it's going to use 4 retention pins on the 4 corners that can be a little bit finicky. So just keep in mind lefty-loosey, so you want to make sure these are all twisted to the left. That should disengage them. And then when you push down, it's going to do this and pop out those little prongs on the bottom to catch the bottom of the motherboard. And then if you twist it to the right, it should lock it in place so it can't pop out. Twist it back to the left. That will allow it to pop off to disengage if you ever need to remove this. And of course, we again have a CPU fan plug that we're going to need to plug into the CPU fan header on the motherboard, making sure all 4 of these pins are twisted to the left and disengaged. Again, in a real world situation, you would have thermal paste down there. And then we just line up the 4 pins. These pins are either on or off, so you can't really ease it down by the 4-corner method like we did before. Just make sure the bottom of the pin is down through the motherboard, then push and turn. And that should lock it into place. Now we'll do the other 4 corners. And if you did it right, the bottom of the motherboard, all 4 of the pins should look like that, being gently pushed aside by that center pin so they stay in place. All right, and that's how you install a CPU and stock heatsink fan for the current 3 platforms on the market. Let's move on with the setup of the rest of the motherboard. Other nice thing about having the CPU installed is that that's probably one of the more complex parts, especially for beginners of building a new PC. Next, we're gonna move on to memory, which is much simpler, especially if you already have the right kind of memory for your motherboard. So again, DDR4 and DDR5 are the current standards. DDR4 is a little bit older. DDR5 will always be the memory you use for AM5, and then it's gonna be up to the motherboard for LGA 1700 on Intel's current platform. Do note that they are not intercompatible, and in fact the notch that's there to help guide it into the socket and make sure you don't install it improperly is not in the same spot on DDR4 and DDR5. So that should be yet another thing that prevents you from accidentally installing it the wrong way. But which slots should you install your memory to? Some motherboards only have 2 DIMM slots or dual inline memory module slots, and in that case just install your 2 sticks to the 2 slots. But many motherboards like this one will have 4 slots, which is nice because you can add more memory in the future if you want to fairly easily. You do want to populate the right slots though to make sure you're setting up your memory in dual channel mode. And for most motherboards out there, it's going to be every other slot for dual channel mode, and usually they want you to start populating the 2 slots that are further away from the CPU versus the 2 that are closer. This Gigabyte motherboard actually has it labeled right there on the board itself which 2 slots to populate, but you can also double check your motherboard's manual to get their guidance on which slots get memory first. And the installation is simple and satisfying. Release the catches. There's usually catches on at least one side. Sometimes this side does not have a catch, and some motherboards have both. Make sure you're aligning the notch on the memory with the ridge that sticks up in the center or slightly off center of the motherboard socket, and apply firm downward pressure to snap it into place. You'll also often find that the sticker with the stats for your memory will face inside, and that gives sort of a nicer aesthetic look to the exterior of your RAM, but that is not universal. Here's one more. And now our RAM is installed. It pops into place with a satisfying click. And lastly, for the motherboard setup, we have our little M.2 SSD right here, which is kind of like a stick of gum. I'm going to talk a little bit more about M.2 SSDs and the various flavors they come in, as well as the heatsink options for them in the part 3 video. And just like memory, you might have more than one place that you can install one. We have 2 M.2 slots here on the motherboard, one here and one here. And those might be connected in different ways. Some are wired up directly to the CPU, some are wired up so they pass through the chipset first, some might be PCI Express Gen 4, some might be PCI Express Gen 5. And again, here's where your motherboard manual will help elucidate some of that information. And since it's the AM5 CPUs that have a bit more crossover between Gen 4 and Gen 5, I'll talk a little bit more about it in that build video. Our motherboard again has them labeled pretty clearly. We have M.2 CPU and M.2 SB, which stands for Southbridge, which refers to the chipset. So to get the best performance out of our M.2 SSD, we're going to install to the top slot right here, closest to the CPU. M.2 devices can actually be different lengths. So this is the slot where it connects down here, but there is a 2242, 2260, and 2280. And 2280 retention mechanism. The vast majority of M.2 drives that you will experience in the present day are going to be 2280. That's 22 millimeters wide and 80 millimeters long, which is why this motherboard already has its standoff mounted right here. So we're just going to remove the teeny tiny screw from that. Note that our M.2 drive is keyed. That should line up with the socket. We push it in like so, drop it down, screw the teeny tiny screw back in, and then it should be held fairly securely. Some M.2 slots have heat sinks that mount on top of them. Most M.2 drives don't get hot enough to require that, but again, I'll cover that a little bit more in the advanced part 3 video. Here's a quick aside about storage before we power on this outside the box build. M.2 NVMe SSDs like this one are super nice and convenient, but you might have supplemental storage for your build as well, such as a 2.5-inch SSD like this one, or a 3.5-inch mechanical spinning hard drive like this one. While an M.2 drive mounts directly to the motherboard and gets both power and data connectivity through this connector on the end, 2.5-inch SSDs and 3.5-inch hard drives have a SATA connector, slightly older standard like this one, and you might notice that there are 2 plugs. The shorter of those 2 plugs is for your data connection, and that has a cable like this. Do note that these are keyed as well. They are L-shaped. So for each SATA drive that you want to connect to your system, you would need one SATA data cable like this. And most motherboards come with between 2 and 6 of these. And the other end for data would plug into one of the SATA ports on your motherboard. But the drive also needs power, and for that you'll need a plug that comes over from your power supply. These are SATA power plugs. A power supply will often have a daisy chain set of 3 or 4 of these coming off of one connector. And while they are bigger, again, they are L-shaped, so just make sure that that is aligned and plug that in as well, so that your extra storage drives will have both a data connection and power. But again, you do not need to set up and plug in your storage drives for this outside of the box build, but you can do that if you want to make sure that they're recognized by your motherboard. So to test these components before we install them in the case, all you're going to need is that motherboard assembly that we just put together, power supply, and graphics card if you don't have integrated graphics in your CPU. And if you're keeping count, that's actually 6 of the 7 parts. We have motherboard, CPU, memory, storage over here, power supply, graphics card. All that's left is case. But for this quick test, we're going to use the motherboard box, set our motherboard on top of that. We're going to install our graphics card. It has a full-length PCI Express slot here on this side. The parts with the gold contacts are the actual connector that goes into the slot. It also has this extra bit that sticks off the end that acts as a catch to hold it in place. If you line up that PCI Express slot, these 2 prongs will hang over the end and actually tuck behind the motherboard. And this will install a lot more firmly when you actually are installing it into a case. It will be a little bit wobbly from right now, but there is a little latch here at the other end of the PCI Express slot, and that should engage with a little bit of a click when it drops all the way in. From there, we're going to connect up our power supply. So we have 2 cables that are going to plug into the motherboard, the longer 24-pin main motherboard power connector, and the supplemental CPU power connector. And this is typically an 8-pin, although it can be as few as 4 for lower end boards that don't require as much power, or for higher end boards that have overclocking support and higher end power delivery, you might have 8+4 or even 8+8. Most discrete graphics cards also require a direct power connection from the power supply. For that, we have these plugs called PEG, or PCI Express Graphics Power Connectors. These are also 8-pin connectors in a block very similar to the CPU one. But do note that while the CPU block splits into 2 blocks of 4, the PEG, or PCI Express Graphics connector, has a 6-pin and then a +2 pin. And again, depending on the graphics card you're using, you might have just a 6-pin, you might have an 8-pin, you might have an 8+6, 8+8, 8+8+8. They can get pretty power hungry. There's also a new power connector called 12VH power that we're not going to talk about today, but I will talk about in the 3rd video where I build the higher end system. One final note is that the actual housing for each pin is also keyed on these plugs, so it really does take a lot of work to plug it in the wrong way. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that should give you a little bit more peace of mind while plugging these connectors in. And you might also note that they all have a latch on one side, and that's a good way to help you with orientation because there's going to be a catch on one side of each of these big connectors that you plug in as well. These can be a little bit stiff, but if you start getting it plugged in, you should be able to just wiggle it a little bit side to side, and you should hear that latch engage as well. One more with the PCI Express graphics. This one is a daisy chain connector, so if you do have an 8+8, you can use both of these. It's generally recommended to use 1 modular cable per connector, but you can use the daisy chain if necessary. And since the graphics card isn't being supported by the case right now, I would say give it a bit of extra support with your other hand while you plug this connector in too. From there, we're just plugging a few more things in. We have a power cable here for our power supply. I've connected up a keyboard just so we can control when we boot into the UEFI. And we've got an HDMI cable running over to our monitor. But now, how do we turn it on? Some motherboards come with a surface-mounted power button that you can just push to turn it on. But since this is more of a budget board, it doesn't have that feature. We're going to do the same thing that would be done if you push the power button on your case, which is simply bridge a connection for a split second. That gives the motherboard the signal to turn on. For that, we're going to reference our front panel power connectors over here. We're going to find the one that's labeled power. In this case, it has a red background behind those two pins, which makes it a little bit easier to find. And we're just going to bridge those two pins for a second using a flathead screwdriver, after we turn our power supply on, of course. So here we go. And you should have a light, fan spin. The system should turn on. It's always nice when it's really quiet right off the bat. It's probably gonna take a minute. We have a splash on the screen with our Gigabyte logo. Depending on what brand motherboard you have, you might see Gigabyte, Asus, MSI, ASRock. And now it's saying, hey, we tried to boot into an operating system like Windows and none was found because we haven't installed an operating system onto our storage device yet. If you get to this point, it's a pretty fair bet that you have functional hardware and you can move on with the rest of the build. To turn off, you can just turn off the switch on the power supply or bridge that power button again. I'm gonna reset real quick and tap the delete button as the system boots up to get into the UEFI, just so we can reality check that all our hardware is being recognized. So by tapping the delete button while the motherboard is booting up, we can access this. This is officially the UEFI. It's also sometimes known as the BIOS, or Basic Input Output System, which is a legacy name, but it's still used frequently. And again, this is something I'm going to go over in more detail in the part 4 video where I go over system setup. You might also be looking at a very different screen if you have a motherboard that's made by a different manufacturer, but here in easy mode, we can quickly reality check that all the hardware is being recognized by the motherboard. We can see the motherboard name, the current BIOS version, our CPU that was installed, the Ryzen 5 5600, both of our 8GB DDR4 sticks, and don't worry if the speed that's shown there is not the speed that's referenced on your sticks. You need to set that up. Again, we'll go over that in part 4. We can also see our NVMe SSD that was installed, and the single fan for the CPU is currently spinning. So now the outside the box build is complete, we verified that the hardware is working, we can install it in the case, and yes, you could skip this step to save some time and just install everything in the case. I've done that often myself. The failure rate for PC hardware is generally quite low, but if you do happen to get a defective part, finding it out now versus installing everything in your case first is going to save you some time and help you get that replacement process underway ASAP. And with a brief transition, we are now continuing the build. I've set aside the core components, the outside of the box build that we put together, so we can get the case out of its box. Here's all you need to know to be a professional computer case unboxer. We open the top flaps, we flip the entire thing over. Do you note the handle holes right here? We want to reach in there and pull these out. Then we slide the box off. Warning, you're about to get a static shock. You should use your elbow and get shocked. A computer case will almost always shock you the first time you take it out of the box, but if you use your elbow, it's a little bit less intense. Then if you want to be dramatic, oh, the foot was cut, that's why. Then if you want to be dramatic, so computer cases can vary a lot in terms of their layout, their look, the aesthetic, how things are installed, but there are some basics that are fairly universal across most models. That's part of the reason I chose this case, is because it has a fairly standard ATX layout, and also some nice ease of use features like captive thumb screws. By just unscrewing this one, we can pop off the tempered glass side panel. This will let us take a look at the internals of the case, get a feel for the layout, and if you have a tempered glass panel like this, or a plexi one for that matter, it's probably going to come with some protective plastic over the top. I recommend leaving that on until the build is complete to protect it from fingerprints and stuff, and you can store this in the box that the case came in, just so you know where it is and you can find it later. By the way, captive thumbscrew t-shirts available at paulshardware.net. This side has the main chamber of the case where the motherboard and most of the components will go. Then on the opposite side we have 2 more thumb screws and another panel that pops off. This is where your cable management will happen, and this is also where you install your power supply down at the bottom. But again, generally speaking, with most cases, you're going to have an intake area here at the front with intake fans that pull air into the case. You may often also have intake down here at the bottom. There might be additional intake fans, or at the very least your power supply, which is going to sit at the bottom of this case, will also be pulling air in from the bottom. And a nice thing to look for in a case is going to be a dust filter for wherever you have air intake coming in to filter dust from getting into the rest of your build, and it makes it a little bit easier to pop off and clean. And again, when it can just pop off as easily as this one on the NZXT H510 Flow, It just makes all of our lives a little bit easier. Likewise, down here at the bottom in the back where the power supply is going to be, there is also a removable dust filter. So if you're shopping for another case, I recommend keeping an eye out for dust filters. But another thing that might be installed for an intake or possibly as an exhaust along the top, although this case doesn't have much support for radiators at the top, it does have support for radiators at the front. So if you're going for an all-in-one liquid cooler, or if you're going to go all out with a custom liquid cooling loop, which we're not covering at all in this video, but I just wanted to mention it, keep an eye out for radiator support. But again, that is one of the nice features about this case, even though it's a bit more on the budget side. You can do two 120mm fans here for a 240mm setup and radiator support there as well, or two 140mm fans, the size is just slightly larger than the one here that it ships with, which is why you have these extra wider mounting holes here, but that will allow you to do a 280mm radiator up the front there too. Other than the airflow where it's coming in, where it's exhausting, going out that way and up through the top, the main motherboard area is right here. There is a big gap there so that you can access the back side of the motherboard for installing aftermarket coolers. Typically down in the power supply basement, you might have some extra trays for some 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives. When the motherboard is installed, the I/O for the motherboard, the inputs and outputs, will face the back right there, and then these are expansion slots, PCI expansion slots, so when your graphics card is installed, that is where the video outs will go. And if you add on other cards like video capture card or otherwise, you have access to more expansion panels there. Meanwhile, here on the other side of the case, they have added a couple more 2.5-inch drive holders, so for SATA drives, you can mount those right here. They have some cable routing channels here with some tie downs. Again, a nice feature to have, not something that will be included in all cases, but something that NZXT adds to make wiring up your cables a little bit easier. You'll almost always have an accessory kit of some kind that's going to include these screws you need to install everything into the case. There's another look at that 3.5-inch drive bay at the bottom, and then you're going to have some pre-wired cables, which in this particular case are coming down from the top because that's where your I/O is, which includes a power button, USB-A, USB-C, and a mic headphone jack. But those need to be connected to your motherboard, so that's what these cables are coming down here for, and they've tied and wrapped them up just to keep them protected until we do the installation. And then in that little accessory box we have a manual that will walk you through installation steps if there's anything I missed today, and a baggie with the remainder of the accessories. And again, this can vary depending on the case that you buy, but another reason I like the NZXT cases is because they individually bag all of your screws and they even label them for you, which is very convenient. You also get a handful of zip ties, which are great for cable management. This is an audio splitter cable since it's actually a combo jack there at the front for mic and headphone, so you can split that out to an actual mic and headphone jack if your headset doesn't have this combo plug. And then there's this for front panel header connection, and front panel headers are a big pain in the butt, so I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to that part of the installation. We will now be installing our motherboard, or our full motherboard assembly with the CPU, heatsink fan, the M.2, the memory, into our case over here. So I've again put some mouse mats down just to protect the wood underneath the case. And the first thing that you should always do when installing a motherboard is actually something that I don't have to do today, and this is one of the big differences between the last time I did a build tutorial and now. There are a lot more motherboards these days, even more budget models like our Gaming XV2 that have a fixed I/O shield. The I/O shield is attached to the motherboard. But there are still some motherboards that use an I/O shield like this, so really quickly, if your motherboard has one of these, you will want to install it first. So make sure that the orientation of the motherboard I/O matches the I/O shield. Usually you'll have these round ones for the audio down towards the bottom. So this is the orientation we're going for, but we install it from the inside of the case. This can occasionally require some brute force, but just line it up from the back. Be careful if you have one of these that has some bare metal edges, because those can be sharp. It should pop into place with a bit of pressure, but if it's finicky or if it's flexing back and forth, just use the butt end of your screwdriver from the inside of the case, and maybe, just maybe, ta-da, we popped it in. And then when you install your motherboard, the I/O will pop through these little slots. However, again, we have a fixed I/O shield, so we don't need that. Apart from the I/O shield, you'll also need to install standoffs to the case, and you'll notice that they've included one in a baggie here labeled standoff. This is the standoff right here. This is just a nut they include for tightening the standoffs. And the reason there's only one here is because, again, with this case, they come pre-installed. So generally speaking, for an ATX layout motherboard, you will have 9 standoffs, 3 at the top, 1, 2, 3, 3 across the middle, 4, 5, and 6, and 3 more along the bottom, 7, 8, and 9. Note that even though this is an ATX case, you can install smaller motherboards to it, although it will look kind of awkward because you'll have some open blank space. But that is also why these are labeled A for ATX, U for micro ATX, and I for ITX. So that's how you know, for example, that you do not need a standoff in this U mount here because that is for micro ATX boards, but you do want one installed here because that's a mounting point for both ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX boards. Also note that this center standoff here is actually a stud that sticks up versus this standoff over here, which is actually a screw hole for screwing a screw into. If you determine based on your case's layout and based on reality checking your motherboard itself, where again, we should be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 mounting points. But if you need a standoff for your motherboard somewhere where there is not one, like sometimes they'll add a micro ATX mounting point right here, and you don't have to use that, but you could. But if you did need to mount an additional standoff, just choose the mounting point where you need it. You can hand thread it in, and then you can use the included nut to tighten that down, either by hand or with the aid of a screwdriver. And for installing standoffs, I actually recommend tightening these down pretty tight because you don't want them to back out if you're uninstalling a motherboard. Speaking of uninstalling, I already mentioned that we do not need a screw right here, so that is something else that you should be double checking. The reason we use standoffs is so that the motherboard doesn't touch this conductive metal that's beneath it. So likewise, if we have a standoff mounted somewhere where there is not an actual mounting point on the motherboard, we would want to remove that so we don't short the board. With the standoff situation sorted, we're now ready to install our motherboard into the case. So we're just going to drop it down, angling the I/O towards the back of the case where the I/O needs to go. I even will reach through there just to grab it and sort of guide it into place. And again, the nice thing about that center stud mount from the standoffs is if you pop it onto that stud, then the rest of the standoff mounts should line up fairly well. Now we need to secure the motherboard, but another one of the funny quirks about PC building is that there are two standards for the screws that are typically used. One is an imperial standard, which is UNC 632, and then there's a metric standard, which is M3. You might be able to tell that the M3 screws have much finer threading, whereas the 632 screws are a bit rougher, a bit wider spaced for the threading. It likely tells you which of these you should use in the manual, but a really easy way to reality check that is just to use the standoff that came also in the baggie, the unused one, and just to thread one in and make sure it threads in properly. And incidentally, they want you to use the 632s for this and not the M3s. It is really, really convenient to have a magnetic tip Phillips head screwdriver for this particular part. You might need to shift the motherboard over just a little bit to line up the standoff. And then this part should be as easy as screwing in 9 screws. You want to get them snug, but again, don't over tighten them because you don't want to over tighten them to the point where if you ever remove the screw, it's going to unscrew the standoff beneath it as well. Now all 8 screws are screwed in. That's 9 standoff points with the stud in the middle. And our motherboard is secured in the case. And since we did the outside of the box build, we actually only have a few more things left to do. We need to connect our 2 fans up to the motherboard so the fans will spin up and have power. We need to install our power supply, of course, and wire up the motherboard with power. I will install a SATA SSD just to show you guys how that is done. And then lastly, we will install our graphics card. Power supply installation is next, and I've already talked about this being a partially modular power supply. Plugged in one of the modular cables so that we can power the graphics card when we did the outside of the box build. So here we're just going to make sure that we have all the cables plugged into the power supply that we're going to need before we install the power supply in the case. And that includes the CPU 8+8 pin header that we used in the outside the box build that is hardwired to this power supply, also the 24-pin main motherboard power connector, the PCIe connector for the graphics card, and then what else might we need? Because fans will often plug directly into the motherboard, which is typically the way I recommend going about it, because then you can use your motherboard software or a UEFI interface to set their speeds or a silent profile, for example. Some cases will have a built-in fan hub, so take a look and see if you have any of these plugs. This is a 4-pin plug, and this is typically called a Molex plug. These are becoming slightly less common. This is one of the older plugs in PC building, and it's a bit more common these days to see a SATA power plug, serial ATA for power, and this is the one that I'm pointing at right here. You will need one serial ATA power plug like this one for each drive that you add that is a 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch SATA drive. And then again, there might be extra things in your case like a fan controller or RGB controller, and those can sometimes have SATA power plugs too. So if you have a non-modular power supply, then you'll probably have a bunch of cables connected up here, and you can fish through those to see if you have SATA power plugs, Molex power plugs, or whatever you need. Funny thing about this build, at least the most budget level of it where you're just going with a single storage drive, is you don't need any of these. And in fact, we could get away with just the power cables that we connected for our outside of the box build. But since lots of people will still be using SATA drives like this one or 3.5-inch mechanical drives, I'm going to be installing one today. So we're going to need one of these modular cables, which has a single proprietary plug on the end that will plug into the power supply. And do note, you should never try to use these between different power supply models. They often change, even from the same brand. That is a way that you can damage the parts in your computer, so only use the modular cables that come with your power supply. And then you'll often have maybe 2 to 4 SATA power plugs on the other end. Or if you do need a Molex plug, or even this other one on the end, which is actually an old school floppy power connector, and these are actually very rare, but they often still include them on the power supply in case it's needed. But this power supply comes with one combo cable. It has a SATA power plug, Molex power, and that floppy drive. So this can be convenient if you need more than one type of connector. For this build, I just need that one SATA connector though, so double check the labeling here on the back. These will often be keyed, so you can't accidentally plug one in the wrong way. These are all labeled HDD SATA, so we'll plug that in. And now we can install our power supply. Remember, the fans in a power supply are almost always going to be an intake, so we want to face that down so it will align with that dust filter. We will slide the PSU in from the side here. If I turn our case, we can see the mounting points at the back. The bracket for most power supply mounts will actually have 8 mounting points because it's made so you can flip the power supply over and mount it either way if you want. We are again going to use these 632 screws, but we have a separate baggie here of these screws, which are a little bit beefier than the other ones we used for the motherboard mount. And again, it's very common to find a set of these screws both included with the case and also with the power supply. All right, now the power supply is installed too. And now we get to go about plugging stuff in, and there's several groups here. I'm going to try to do it a couple groups at a time. We're going to start with the main motherboard power connectors, that 24-pin and the 8-pin. And we're also getting started with cable management here. Now, don't be afraid to have messy cables, especially if you're building for the first time. It is really not that big of a deal. It really does not affect your airflow all that much to have a bit of a messy cable management situation. And while some cases like this have channels and Velcro straps, so you can really get your cables positioned exactly where you want them to, that's not always going to be the case with every single case that's out there. And really the main thing you want to make sure is done is just that the cable itself is plugged in. So you're probably going to have some pass-throughs for those cables. We have a line along this side. Depending on your motherboard layout, you might want to pass the cables through in different positions. I'm just going to feed the 24-pin through there. And for the 8-pin supplemental CPU power, we typically have a longer cable because that plug is usually at this top corner of the motherboard, looking at the back side of the motherboard from this angle. So we're just going to feed the blocky end of the plug through the top there, and then again, channel it down here as best we can. We've already plugged this plug in once before, so again, just pay attention to where the latch is, where the catch is on the plug. And we're going to bend this around some so it will line up with the plug itself. And we'll go ahead and seat it in the plug, and we'll hear a little snap when it latches into place. Same deal for our supplemental CPU power, although you might have a bit of a tight space to work with here in the corner. Just got all the pins lined up, and then we can go ahead and seat this one as well. And this, if you have a fully modular power supply, some builders will actually plug this side in first before the motherboard's installed, just because, again, it can be a little bit tough to work with up there in the corner. Now, while we're working up in this corner, I'm actually going to plug in this rear exhaust fan as well. The 2 fans that ship with this case have 3-pin fan header plugs. Those work just as fine as the 4-pin one that we showed you with the CPU heatsink fan. And I can show you the fan header that's up here on the corner of the board, but I know you're not going to be able to see me plugging this in right now. So here I'm going to plug in the front intake fan to this System Fan 3 header. Note that it's a 4-pin header. There is a plastic tab behind 3 of those pins, and that is the side that you want to plug in a 3-pin fan header to if you're not using a 4-pin header. The 4th pin carries a PWM signal, so if you have a PWM enabled fan, you'll have a 4-pin header. 3-pin fans work just fine as well though, but do note that you will have an extra pin hanging out there that doesn't get used. Since we plugged in our 2 case fans, let's finish off the rest of the case connectors. These are typically known as front panel connectors because they are what enable the front panel plugs like USB and power button. Let's start with these 2 here, which are USB connectors. This is a USB 3.0 connector, slightly older. These are not the favorite of a lot of PC builders because they can be a little bulky. And the updated version of this connector is this one here, which comes with the cover. This is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 front panel connector, which can provide much higher bandwidth, 5 to 10 gigabits per second. And thankfully, our motherboard does have one of these ports available, so we can enable that Type-C port on the front of the case. The other two connectors here are in a block of 10 pins, and they're both labeled. One is F panel for front panel connectors, and one is HD audio for enabling that mic and headphone jack on top of the case. Now you may notice that the front panel audio connector has one blocked pin. That's to keep you from accidentally plugging one of these into the other's header on the motherboard. And honestly, if you were going to skip one of these connectors, I'd say the HD audio is the one to skip. Front panel audio can be not the greatest. And if you do have a high quality headset or a pair of headphones, you should plug those into the connector on the back of the motherboard rather than using this. Front panel connectors, on the other hand, are almost universally reviled amongst PC builders, but NZXT has been using this single block for front panel connection for quite some time, and you'll find this to be compatible with the vast majority of motherboards on the market. It's going to make it a lot easier to connect those up. But if your motherboard does not adhere to the same layout as these, then you will need to use this adapter. And if you're building in a different case, you might not have this front panel block, and instead you might have individual connectors for power LED, positive and negative, power switch, and hard drive LED. You might also sometimes have a 2-pin connector here that is a reset switch. Different motherboards have different layouts, but most of the connectors for these are going to be along this edge or along the bottom edge of the motherboard. Oftentimes the HD audio will be further down this side. So check where your motherboard's connectors are, and then once again, feed these from the rear of the case up through to the front of the case. And do note that if some of your cables are pre-managed, you can undo that if you need a little bit more cable length. Back here in the main chamber, we are plugging in our front panel connectors. Here's the USB 3.0, here's that USB 3.2 Gen 2. You can double check the manual to make sure where these are. They should be labeled though, and they should also be the right shape for these plugs. Do note that these plugs are keyed. There's a little notch on the top of the USB 3.0 one that should align with a little gap in the housing of the plug connector on the motherboard itself. And then for the 3.2 Gen 2 connector, it's a bit wider on one side. You should hopefully be able to tell, but it's really difficult to plug this in the wrong way. It is difficult to plug this in a way that also shows it happening on the camera though. There we go. Okay, plugged in. Down here we have our HD audio connector, which again is labeled there inside the plug, audio. And also keyed with one blank pin. So here I will wrap this around. Just completely blocking the shot with my hand. Get that lined up and then push it into the plug. There we go. And if there's a second reason to not plug in your front panel HD audio connector, it's because of the garish colors on the cable, but we'll leave it in for now. And now our front panel connectors. A lot of PC builders hate these because individual pin headers are kind of difficult to plug in. Note that the power LED here is labeled with a positive and a negative. Same goes for the hard drive LED. For the light to work, you gotta plug in the right positive and negative points to the headers on the board. And while the pinouts are labeled with a little grid down there underneath this plug, if you can't read those or just need to double check, then look in your motherboard manual where it should label all of the pinouts. And then on Gigabyte boards, they also color code them, which is convenient. So we're going to cheat by using the NZXT block connector, which is only going to use the pinouts over on the left side here. Do note that there are a couple power LED connectors here. There's one down here in the bottom right and also in the top left. So our block connector should still work. We're nearly finished with this build. We're going to quickly talk about installing extra storage drives like 2.5-inch SATA drives or 3.5-inch mechanical drives. 3.5-inch drives have mounting points on the bottom. They also have mounting points along the side. And there are a variety of methods for installing those into a case and keeping them secure. I've even seen rubber bands used at certain points. A lot of cases will have trays that you can remove and then mount to the drive, and then the drive slides into a tray. For this case, you actually have to remove the tray from the bottom with some screws, and then you can pull this tray out, and then you can mount the drives to it and then reinstall. So again, reference your case's manual for 3.5-inch drive installation. I'm going to focus on 2.5-inch drives today because those are a bit more common. 2.5-inch drives also have multiple ways to mount them and set them up with a case. Has anyone been able to tell that this is one of my SSDs where I have a Steam library? Anyway, there are mounting points on the side. There are also mounting points on the bottom. And different cases might have different trays or mounting methods for those, but this one mounts through those 4 screw holes from the bottom. And here's one of the places we'll be using those M3 screws, the ones that are a little bit finer threading. And you can easily get away with just a couple screws for an SSD. There are no moving parts inside, so
not a big deal. For spinning mechanical drives, it's a bit more important to get all your mounting points mounted with screws, so for the sake of being thorough, we'll go ahead and use all 4 for this one. And then before we reinstall it on the case, we should plug it in and make sure it's functional. So for that, once again, we need SATA power, and for that we're going to use the long SATA power plug that we already pre-wired over from our power supply. And then you will need a SATA data cable, and this should come with your motherboard. And both of these plug types are keyed with an L shape, so it's very, very difficult to plug them in the wrong way. And occasionally your plug will have a little catch that sometimes catches effectively and sometimes doesn't. But like I said, there are no moving parts with SSDs, so as long as it's plugged in, it should stay plugged in. And these trays have 5 little points that sort of snap into place, and then we can secure it at the top with 1 more screw. Oh yeah, and don't forget to plug the other end of your SATA data cable into your motherboard, and we'll route it through here for that. This motherboard has 4 connection points for SATA data cables. 2 are up here and 2 are down here that are angled 90 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and use these lower ones because they're a little bit more low profile. You used to have to sort of double check which SATA connector you were using because some were slower than others. But fortunately for more recent generations of PC hardware, the SATA ports have topped out at 6 gigabit per second, and all of them should conform to that standard. And we are now on to the final step in this build, the installation of the graphics card. And again, we already tested the graphics card, so you know it works. But practically speaking, for installation, we're just going to need to line up this PCI Express edge connector with the slot on the motherboard. And we need to remove a couple of those expansion slot covers because they're going to be replaced by this back I/O panel on the graphics card. This is a 2-slot card, 1 bracket and 2 brackets, and there are some higher end cards that use 3, sometimes even 4 with the RTX 40 series. So we actually won't be starting with this top one. We're going to start with the second one down. You can tell that by sort of visually aligning with the bracket itself or by sort of positioning the card kind of where it's going to be. But for this case, to save a little space, the removal actually happens on the exterior. So first we loosen these 2 thumb screws, and that lets us pull this little slider back a little bit. That's slightly awkward, but that's okay. Then we can use our Phillips head to remove these 2 screws. Sometimes the bracket just conveniently falls out for you when you get the screw off. Here they are, and you can store these in your motherboard box in case you ever need them in the future. And now we can install the graphics card, align the I/O on the back with those 2 panels you just removed, line up that edge connector with the slot, some firm pressure, and it should snap into place. And one more time, that catch at the end of the motherboard's PCI Express bracket should snap into place and secure the card. But we're going to secure it a bit further by reinstalling these screws. And then we can slide this bracket cover back into place as well. And we'll tighten up this thumb screw to make sure this doesn't slide around. And yes, it's okay to use a screwdriver on a thumb screw sometimes. Actually, hold on. This case has an extra little pass-through point right there. I'm going to use that. And we've done this before, but one more time. We're using the 6+2 pin PCI Express graphics power or PEG connector. Latches on top, catches on top. Do note that some graphics cards flip those so the catch is on the bottom. I'm doing one really quick aesthetic touch by tying down the daisy chain connector here with a zip tie just so it's not hanging loose. And now we plug this one in. Snap. And with that, our graphics card is installed, and indeed, our system is assembled. So at this point, I, and hopefully you as well, have now completed your first ever gaming PC build. Well, it's not my first ever. I've done this once or twice before, but we can be fairly confident, since we did the outside the box build, that this system should power on. I'm going to turn on the power switch on the back. I'm going to press the power switch up here. Fans are spinning. Maybe things that have lights on them are going to light up. And from here, we can move on to the next steps of installing the operating system and getting the system set up appropriately to game on or do lots of other tasks. I have a couple existing videos on that. I will link those down in the video description if you're watching this video close to when I first publish it. But in a week or two, I'm going to have a follow-up refresher to that showing you how to get Windows installed and do all those setup things as well. Now we have the final build fun things to do. And if you're a superstitious PC builder, you typically leave these for last, or at least until after you've verified that the system has baseline functionality. Back in goes our tempered glass panel. secure that with the thumb screw, and now the peel. Why don't they put this sticker on the outside of the plastic? Residue. But guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this part 2 video in my How to Build a PC in 2023 series. Part 3 is gonna be coming soon, where I will build a high-end system with RGB lighting and fancy other things in there that might take a little bit more work to get installed. And then in part 4, we'll be going over system setup, getting Windows installed, and getting everything ready to go for gaming, streaming, and doing a bit of testing to make sure the hardware works as advertised. Speaking of advertising, if you enjoyed this video and you want to help support my channel, check out my store at paulshardware.net, where I have shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and all manner of memorabilia with Paul's Hardware thumbscrew logos attached, including this shirt that has all the parts of the PC. Now that you know what they are, wear a shirt with them on it. I will also include a ton of links in the video's description to the hardware that I used today, to other videos in my tutorial series that will help you get everything up and running just the way you like it, and the playlist for the entire Beginner's Guide to Building a PC series. Thank you guys so much again for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up button on your way out. Consider subscribing to my channel as well, because this is not the only PC build I have coming at you this month. No, I have another one coming real soon that's not even part of this build series. So stay tuned for more, and we'll see you all in the next video.